individuals whom you reference are in fact in custody. We did not have derogatory information when they were first encountered.
Shameful that Speaker Johnson is going down this route, but it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone.
We have to look at the arguments of the far right and the far left and say, you cannot destroy this country with your rhetoric and your arguments.
Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. Bloomberg News has obtained what appears to be an unreleased Supreme Court opinion that would allow abortions in medical emergencies in Idaho. This became a question after Idaho passed a law placing some limits on abortion access after the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade. Now, according to the Bloomberg report, this document briefly appeared on the Supreme Court's website, was then quickly removed. CBS News, it is important to note, has not yet independently obtained a copy of that Supreme Court opinion. I want to bring in our chief legal correspondent, Jan Crawford. Jan, what's the case, and did this thing that appeared ever so briefly on the High Court's website appear to be the opinion we're waiting for?
Answer your first question, your second question first. Yes, that does appear to be the opinion in what is one of the most closely watched cases of the term. The first case the Supreme Court has taken up about a state's ban criminalizing abortion since it overturned Roe versus Wade 2 years ago. You mentioned it was a case out of Idaho. The Idaho law is one of the most restrictive in the country, one of 6 states that ban abortion except to save a mother's life or in cases of rape or incest. The Biden administration sued almost immediately after that law took effect and said, wait a minute, there's a federal law that should override that. That federal law would require stabilizing care in hospitals that in some rare cases could include an abortion when the woman's health was also at risk. So they're saying there are other circumstances where Idaho must be able to perform these abortions. That is a big issue. These are unusual cases, fortunately rare cases, but women have complications in pregnancies. And at times, abortion can be the recommended method of treatment when their health also is at risk. So that was the issue. That's one of the, obviously, the stakes are high. And today, Bloomberg revealed that it had somehow grabbed a copy of what appears to be the opinions in that case that have not yet been released. The Supreme Court is not commenting on the specifics, but it did confirm that a document was inadvertently briefly put on the court's website, and the opinions in the cases, all cases, will be released in due course.
What did that opinion say in general, or should we even wade into what that opinion said?
No, I think we can wade into it because I feel like when you look at the document itself, there is a finality about it. It's formatted like an opinion. It has multiple writings from different justices. It looks to me, based on the argument, it's not a surprising outcome. And so I think this opinion, it may change some, it may change completely. But right now, this appears, I doubt that will happen because it does appear to have kind of this finality about it. And that means if this decision is the final decision and we get it tomorrow or the next day or sometime between the end of the term, they'll announce it from the bench like they do all their cases. They don't just pop them up on the website and take them back down. That means that the Biden administration has secured a win for now. It means that these rare abortions for medical emergencies when a woman's health is at risk can resume in Iowa, and this issue will then play out in the lower courts. The justices in the majority in this case, that's in this draft opinion, thought that the court had made a mistake by taking this case right now. There's still some unresolved issues in the lower courts. The Biden administration had urged the court not to take up this case. They did it anyway. And now the court is saying, you know what? We read the briefs, we heard the arguments, we shouldn't have gotten in. We're going to let this play out in the lower courts. And while that plays out in the lower courts, the justices say in this opinion that Bloomberg has, while this plays out in the lower courts, we're going to let an injunction be restored that a judge had put into place, blocking that part of that Idaho law and saying that these kind of abortions for medical emergencies where the women's health is at stake, those can resume.
There was a period of time of great uncertainty about this in Idaho. Now that uncertainty for a period of time may be lifted. Jan Crawford, thank you so very much. The Supreme Court also ruled today that the Biden administration and possibly future administrations could continue efforts to press social media companies to remove misinformation or what they term disinformation. By 6-3 vote, the justices tossed out a lower court ruling that found officials were using social media to limit conservative opinions or viewpoints. The case was brought by social media users in Louisiana and Missouri. They argued the administration was violating their free speech rights. Justices Thomas, Gorsuch, and Alito dissented in that opinion. President Biden and Donald Trump will face off tomorrow night in the first general election debate at CNN's Atlanta studios at 9 p.m. Eastern. Here's a bit of what happened the last time these two went head-to-head at a debate.
The character of the country is on the ballot. Our character is on the ballot. Look at us closely.
Let me ask some follow-up. Please respond, and then we're going to have follow-up questions.
If this stuff is true about Russia, Ukraine, China, other countries, Iraq, if this is true, then he's a corrupt politician.
Right.
So don't give me the stuff about how you're this innocent baby.
Our Nancy Cordes joins us now from Atlanta. Nancy, in general, what's the atmosphere there?
Well, Major, there's a great deal of anticipation. Both campaigns have a significant presence here. And now that we're just one day away from this first of what we expect at this point will be two presidential debates between now and Election Day. The stakes couldn't be higher, not only because this is an event that is sure to get a lot of attention around the country, particularly from voters who maybe weren't tuned in that closely before now, but also because this state of Georgia is one of the key battleground states. You'll remember Trump won it by about 5 points back in 2016, but then he famously lost it by about 12,000 votes to President Biden in 2020. So there is a fierce matchup going on here. Both of the campaigns holding events today to try to reach Atlanta voters, African-American voters in particular. The two candidates are not here in Atlanta yet, but the former president called into an event at a black-owned barbershop here in Atlanta today, and they'll both be arriving tomorrow for this first of two debates.
And to what degree can you describe the length and depth of the president's preparations, Nancy?
It has been lengthy, and by all accounts, it has gone into great depth. He's been holding sessions, formal sessions, informal sessions, mock debates with his key advisors at Camp David for the better part of 6 days now, Major. And that is meant in part to avoid a curse that has befallen a lot of presidents, where they don't do that well in the first presidential debate, often because they are consumed by their day job, which is a significant impediment, but also because, as we saw in 2012, President Obama didn't do that much prep because he thought, I've got this. I deal with these issues day in and day out. How much preparation do I really need to do? That's what his aides said his outlook was at the time. And then you end up being a little rusty when you come into these high-pressure debates. So they're looking to avoid that this time around with quite a bit of prep, while former President Trump, on the other hand, claimed in an interview with Newsmax today he doesn't need much prep. He's been studying these issues for years. I have to tell you, Major, the Biden team is pretty skeptical of that claim. They point out that he has, not been in public much at all over the past 4 days. He held one fundraiser in New Orleans, so they think that he's doing more preparation with his team than he's letting on.
Nancy, also some news there today. Former Republican congressman, and he was also a member of the January 6th Select Committee, Adam Kinzinger, endorsed President Biden's re-election. And he also talked to you about something that the Trump campaign has tried to inject into the atmosphere around this, that, Biden will be on some sort of amphetamine or some sort of thing to jack him up for the debate performance. What did he tell you? That is to say, Kinzinger.
What he told me, Major, is that Trump tends to turn to conspiracies every time there's a piece of information that doesn't go his way. After all, this is something that Trump did in 2016 before the debates with Hillary Clinton, and 2020 before his last debate with Joe Biden. Kinzinger insisted that it's not going to work this time. Take a listen to what he told me.
They're setting expectations that if Joe Biden does well and better than Donald Trump, it must be some outside influence like drugs. It's asinine. It's insane. It's disrespectful to the president of the United States, regardless of who's president. And it just goes to show how desperate they are.
I've talked to the Biden team quite a bit about this, Major, and while it frustrates them to hear an accusation hurled at President Biden that they say is completely baseless, not just by Trump, by the way, but by members of his team, they like to point out that Joe Biden famously doesn't even drink. And so it's unlikely he's going to be using any foreign substances tomorrow or at any point in the future.
Nancy Cordes with us from Atlanta. Thank you so very much. Don't forget, here's a programming note. I'll get that out. Join us at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. in the West tomorrow for coverage of the presidential debate right here on CBS News 24/7. This program will kick off coverage with a special edition of America Decides live from the Spin Room in Atlanta at our usual time. You are streaming CBS News. Welcome back to America Decides. House Speaker Mike Johnson is vowing to file a legal brief in support of Steve Bannon's emergency appeal in his contempt of Congress case. Bannon, a longtime ally of former President Trump, is supposed to report to prison Monday, that to begin serving a 4-month sentence. But Bannon is asking the Supreme Court to intervene to delay that. The Justice Department has urged the Supreme Court to reject this request. Bannon, you might remember, was convicted nearly 2 years ago for defying a subpoena issued by the January 6th committee. National political reporter for the Washington Post, Isaac Arnsdorf, joins us now. Isaac, we sort of summarized the legal back and forth. Let's skip that part. I'd like you to describe for our audience's benefit what effect Bannon has in Trump world writ large and with the former president on, let's say, a day-to-day basis.
Well, Bannon is kind of a singular voice in the MAGA movement. I mean, he's not officially on Trump's campaign like he once was, but, you know, there are some benefits to having that little bit of distance also, where he can kind of try things out and take positions that even the campaign doesn't necessarily want to be responsible for. And actually, you know, this prosecution and conviction and the possibility of a jail sentence here has only served to burnish Bannon's stature in the movement, as Trump himself once told Bannon, this jail thing is making you a star.
And explain to the audience who might not know how Bannon is sort of one of the first echoists of either new Trump lines or existing Trump grievances.
Well, I mean, echoing, but also kind of experimenting, right? You know, trying things out. And there's a way in which, you know, Bannon sort of got MAGA way back in 2015 in a way that he could articulate as a political movement, as a political project ahead of Trump. And there's an extent to which that continues now. And particularly if you look back to the aftermath of January 6th, a moment where Trump was really isolated. And Bannon did a lot, had a huge role in kind of galvanizing the movement in recovering from that defeat and bringing them, mobilizing them back to a place that paved the way where Trump could have a comeback and be the Republican nominee again.
Would you be surprised at all, Isaac, if the former president were to reclaim the White House, Bannon would re-enter the White House in a significant position?
You know, I think similar to the relationship on the campaign now, you know, there's kind of a more natural mode for Bannon to be kind of the outside media iconoclast than to actually be the West Wing employee. So, you know, I think the dynamic that they have now is working pretty well for both of them. You know, they are still in touch, and Bannon is more frequently in touch with some of Trump's aides. So, you know, sometimes we call him former advisor, and you know, really a better term is sometime advisor.
And you picked up on a really important terminology. I said echoing, you said experimenting. That is to say, Bannon often will be the first person to sort of trot out a theory or a line or a point of view of attack. He's done that with President Biden in the lead up to this debate, has he not?
Yeah, and, you know, sometimes those things that Bannon will throw out there, you know, will disappear and never be heard from again if they don't stick. And part of the challenge of reporting on him and listening to his show is trying to sort out what's a lot of blowing smoke and what's real. But, you know, I think recent history has shown when he's onto something, he can really be onto something. And what's going on now, if I've got time, is this delegitimizing of the legal system in parallel to the way that Trump and Bannon and their allies delegitimized the election system back in 2020, and the way that Bannon described himself in a recent speech as a leading edge of being prosecuted, or from his point of view persecuted, in the same way as Trump and the January 6 rioters who have been convicted, and that he described it as that the audience, the MAGA movement, has to be the next wave on the beach.
And that's a really important point, Isaac, because first they cast doubt on a legitimate, verified, legally certified election. Now they cast doubt on the legal system trying to hold them account for doing that. That seems to be a two-pronged effort, both by Bannon and former President Trump, to topple the very system that they believe resists them or try to hold them to account.
Well, when I was interviewing Bannon for my book, he told me basically, I'm not in the rebuilding business, I'm in the tearing down business. And he's very explicit about his goal of trying to demolish the existing establishment, the existing institutions, and set up something to follow. But he's much less interested in what's to follow than he is in the destruction part.
And is he in any way, shape, or form, Isaac, conscious of that gap, meaning I'm all there and eager and willing to tear something down, but don't trouble me with the consequences or my ideas about the rebuild? I mean, don't you have to have the rebuild at least theoretically sketched out to be so confident about the teardown?
I think fundamentally his theory is that if you redefine the two-party system as one elitist, globalist, left-wing party called the Democrats and one working-class, right-of-center, nationalist party called the Republicans, he thinks that's a recipe for Republicans to dominate American politics for decades or even a century.
Because there are no elitists in the Republican Party who support Trump? I mean, come on. There are all sorts of industrialist CEOs and large-scale business types who stroke enormous checks for Trump, have and probably will in the future. How does Bannon walk around that?
Well, that's exactly why you hear Bannon and Trump's supporters being so tough on Republicans, on fellow Republicans, often like getting more animated about them than actually about Democrats, because, they're sort of taking for granted that the Democrats aren't going to be on their side, but the Republicans are the ones in their way of accomplishing this political project. And, Bannon is not wrong when he talks about when he trained the movement to view that the reason that Trump failed in 2020 to keep himself in power despite losing the election was because of a few uncooperative Republicans at key points in the chain of counting and certifying and the peaceful transition of power. And what Bannon and Trump and the Republican Party in their image has systematically done since is try to remove all of those Republicans from the party and from their position so that won't happen next time.
So their power may continue. Isaac Arnsdorf, thanks very much. House Republicans are ramping up efforts to enforce a subpoena against Attorney General Merrick Garland. The House Judiciary Committee will sue the Justice Department to obtain audio recordings of President Biden's interview with Special Counsel Robert Hur. A Florida congresswoman is also pushing to hold Garland in what's called inherent contempt for not turning over those tapes. That could result in him being taken into custody, possibly. The DOJ said it would not bring charges against the Attorney General after the House voted to hold him in contempt over this underlying matter. 69% of Republicans and 59% of Democrats plan to watch tomorrow night's presidential debate. More from our new polling about that debate. That's straight ahead. Welcome back to America Decides. The economy, immigration, foreign policy, access to abortion, the future of democracy, all those issues are expected to come up in one form or another during tomorrow night's presidential debate. Here's a question. What are Americans expecting to hear from those candidates? Well, we have an answer. CBS News Executive Director and Elections and Surveys, Anthony Salvanto, joins us now with brand new CBS polling on this very question. I eagerly await the answer. Anthony, what is on voters' minds?
Brand new indeed, Major, out this hour. So we asked people, look, this in some ways will not surprise anyone. The bulk of people say they want to hear candidates' plans and candidates' policies. Look, there is no debate, if you will, that all of those issues are big, that people see big issues here. So that's behind that. There is this part, this quarter here of those planning to watch who say they're wanting to see if the candidates have the mental and cognitive health to serve. And that reflects some of the data we've seen in other polling where there are concerns. There are concerns about each of these candidates and whether or not they do. I'm going to point this out, which is a little bit of the strategy that people like to engage in ahead of debates, right? How should they be? Well, look at Dems wanting Joe Biden to be more forceful, right? And some of that may be behind the idea that they think he's got a good record to run on. Democrats do. They think the economy's good. They got to make that case. But then look at Republicans saying, what should Donald Trump's tone be? And that's more polite. A little bit of strategy there. They like the fact that they think he's tough, but maybe they're thinking, how does he appeal beyond that base, Major?
That sounds to me, Anthony, as if Republicans know that when Trump isn't polite or presidential, too aggressive, even if they agree or they think the country might agree with his points, he loses some ground.
Yeah, that may well be. And look, a lot of this is voters thinking about what they think other voters are going to want to hear, right? Hey, you can't avoid it. You know, if we're going to engage in, punditry and spin and everything else, let them have at it too. But look, on that very point, what do the candidates need to do besides explaining things? This one popped out at me too. Avoid mistakes. And you got a higher number on that for Joe Biden. Avoid mistakes. And so when you look at that and you say, break that down by party, there's a lot of Democrats who think he needs to avoid mistakes, more so than Republicans think Donald Trump does. Maybe they think he's got more to lose. Maybe they think he's got something to prove. That's all in there, too.
Anthony, anything that tells us how interested, writ large, people are in this debate, considering it's super early in the process, before the conventions?
I think two things. One is what you just saw about that avoid mistakes might speak to a little bit of apprehension, if you will, among some partisans, maybe among some Democrats. I did notice this, that there's fewer Democrats who say that they plan to watch. So there, you want to talk about interest. Well, is it because their mind's made up? Is that because they don't know what's going to happen? We'll see.
Fresh out of the data oven. We don't have an oven, but just metaphorically. Anthony Salvanto, thank you very, very much. Next, we'll bring in our political panel for more on Thursday's first presidential debate. You are streaming America Decides.
It's tough. I think the number one thing on the ballot in 2024 is democracy. This is like the year where if we don't get this right, truly democracy is a threat. And maybe it doesn't go away, but it will always be damaged.
That was former Republican Congressman Adam Kinzinger on my podcast and streaming TV show, The Takeout, way back in December. Today, he officially endorsed President Biden, saying President Biden will, from Kinzinger's perspective, always protect democracy. I want to go back to Atlanta with our political panel, Finn Gomez and Shelby Talcott. Finn, as you well know, CBS News' political director. Shelby is politics reporter for Semaphore. Finn, you're spending a lot of time talking to both Biden and Trump worlds, but I want to emphasize Biden because you've been doing that most recently. Preparations and expectations, what can you tell us?
Preparations, Major, well, it's sort of your traditional model for preparation. He's meeting at Camp David with close advisors, his top senior advisors, going over these sessions over policy, over top issues. And also, they've started in the last couple of days the mock debates with someone playing Donald Trump. We've reported that. Nancy Cordes has reported that is being reprised by Bob Bauer. And so we're seeing that sort of preparation. But in terms of the expectations, something I've heard a lot about in the last couple of days, I think what I keep hearing from both sides is Donald Trump and a lot of his vitriol and description from the campaign trail about the president, about Joe Biden, has sort of lowered the threshold, lowered the standard, the criteria that Joe Biden now has to jump over. So essentially, it's almost backlashed with just a day away before the debate. Major.
Shelby, what is the Trump perspective on preparations and expectations?
Donald Trump has been taking sort of a little bit of a different approach to this debate. He's been holding informal policy discussions with his aides, with people close to him, with top Republicans, even some vice presidential hopefuls. But he's also been out on the campaign trail, and his aides have stressed that part of Donald Trump's preparation has happened over the course of the last several months during those rallies and during those public appearances. So that'll be really interesting to see. And the other thing that I would note is when I talk to Donald Trump's campaign, they say that they are fully prepared to respond to some of these touchier subjects that Joe Biden is most likely going to bring up, which includes the argument that Donald Trump is a threat to democracy, stuff about January 6th, and, of course, his recent conviction in New York.
Finn, as you well know, looking at the email traffic of today, both campaigns have been pre-preparing reporters before this debate with lots of fact checks on each other. CNN has made it pretty clear that its two moderators are not going to routinely fact check. They will let the campaigns and candidates do that themselves in the course of the debate. How do you imagine, based on your reporting, that interaction will go? Do you expect President Biden to try to fact check Donald Trump in real time and vice versa?
Well, the expectation is there that he will be to contrast his vision of where America should go against Donald Trump. So, and that is something that I've been told repeatedly, that he will make that contrast. And in doing so, he would fact check his policies, fact check some of his claims himself. I think you're going to see some of that. And because there's no defined rule about that this time, Major, like no live fact checking from CNN, I think you're going to see a lot of that, and a lot of that going at each other and checking each other and what they're in their statements and what they're essentially proposing to this massive audience that's expected.
Shelby, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree with Finn, and I also think when Finn talks about compare and contrast, that's a phrase I've been hearing from Donald Trump's campaign over and over and over again for the past few weeks. So you can expect that Donald Trump is going to try to do the same thing, compare and contrast his policies and his accomplishments with that of Joe Biden's. And I think in particular topics that are going to be front of mind for Donald Trump to focus on are the border and the economy. And so those are two things that I think we're going to hear a lot about tomorrow.
Yeah, I've been told that too, especially on immigration, the southern border. Expect big swings on that, Major, coming from Trump towards Joe Biden tomorrow night.
Based on my conversations with those very close to the Trump world, and even from some nervous Democrats, they are expecting the former president to basically say four things over and over: inflation, immigration, crime, world on fire. Rinse, repeat. Rinse, repeat. Finn?
Yeah, and one thing I've actually heard as well is that Donald Trump plans to take things a step further and not just go after Joe Biden on some of these things, particularly the border, on the debate stage, but he's also invited some of the family members of people who have been allegedly killed by migrants to Atlanta to sort of speak with reporters before and after the debate.
You mentioned foreign policy, Major. I've been told by those close to Biden that is something they feel that they can flex on, Major, that's something they feel that they can do well. And essentially he will say, like, if you pick Donald Trump, this world that is maybe on fire could be an inferno when he's in the White House. So I think they will definitely lean into that point.
And Finn, picking up on that, Democrats who are not as anxious and as others I've talked to, a little bit more confident going into this debate, say that President Biden will probably also have 3 or 4 words: job creation, access to abortion, future of democracy.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I've been hearing too. Those 3 main points, and I think you will hear that. And again, I think just for historical geeks like you and Major, I must say, this is also, I mean, just to see these two, we haven't seen these two on the same stage together in 4 years. I mean, in that level of anticipation, it just sort of builds this sort of, these big expectations for both of them. You're going to have, the world watching in this major debate with only less than 5 months to go until the November 5th election. So the stakes are going to be so high, Major.
And Shelby, I wonder if you have any reporting about how this debate may or may not feed into the Republican National Convention. It's been my assumption, and I've heard from some Trump people, that they see it as fodder, that if there are missteps or slips for President Biden, real or imagined, they will be running on some kind of loop, or at least in theory, thinking about that at the Republican National Convention. And that would place this debate in a completely different context, something that feeds into the convention as opposed to the conventions occurring before we even get to the general election debate cycle. We're reversing that entire order now.
Absolutely, and that's part of the reason why both campaigns wanted to hold this debate so early. It was because they felt like voters are already voting by the time the debates are traditionally held, but also because this race has started early. Donald Trump has been the Republican nominee for a long time now, and so you can certainly expect that anything major that happens on that debate stage tomorrow, if it benefits Donald Trump, his campaign and Republicans across the country in leadership positions are going to be playing that and highlighting that and really using that to try to run forward into the next few months.
Shelby Talcott and Finn Gomez in Atlanta, thanks so very much. The trial of Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich got underway behind closed doors in Russia today. It has been 15 months since Gershkovich was arrested on espionage charges. Russian authorities have provided zero evidence to support their allegations. His employer, the Wall Street Journal, and the U.S. government vehemently deny all charges placed against Gershkovich by the Russian authorities. Reporters were briefly allowed in the courtroom before those proceedings were closed. How could President Biden or former President Trump, quote unquote, win tomorrow's debate? Well, one man who's watched many presidential debates with American voters as part of debate focus groups, well, he might have the answer, and he joins us next. You're streaming America Decides. As President Biden and former President Trump wrap up debate preparations, they might want to consider some advice from a man who has seen and advised on several debates. In a new opinion piece for the New York Times, pollster and communications strategist Frank Luntz shares the, quote, secret, he says, he's learned from watching presidential debates over the past 3 decades. Quite fortunately for us, Frank Luntz joins us now. Frank, what is the secret you've learned, and what advice would you give to President Biden and former President Trump?
I'm not sure it's a secret, but Major, you and I have been doing this now for more than 3 decades. And I'm looking down at you because I see you're laughing. We've been doing this for every debate since Ross Perot took the stage with George Herbert Walker Bush and Bill Clinton. An example of the secret is that it wasn't Bush looking at his watch that cost him that debate. It was actually Bill Clinton getting off his stool, walking towards the woman so upset over the deficit and what it meant to her and her family, and Clinton empathizing, biting his bottom lip, and showing that kind of emotion that voters so desperately wanted, rather than someone who was a little bit more distant, which was George Bush. Another example, of course, is Reagan back in 1980, asking the famous question, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? Or what he did in 1984, cracking a joke at Walter Mondale's youth and inexperience. Sometimes all it takes is a sense of decency, where you communicate face to face. You look the voters straight in the eyes. I'm looking at you right now, and you communicate your heart and you communicate your soul. Now, let me give you an example of where it doesn't go that way. And that was Donald Trump in 2020. His abuse of Joe Biden in that first debate cost him massive numbers of suburban women who were up to that point undecided, liked Trump on policy, but didn't like his personality. And that debate really hurt him because it was too much. And so sometimes it's not winning the debate that matters, it's just not losing it.
And Frank, that's a great point I want to pick up on, because as you know, in this process, preparation is also influenced by how you read the race currently. How do you read the race currently, and therefore, how do you think that ought to inform how Biden and Trump approach it?
I was shocked that Donald Trump spent the last 2 months ridiculing Joe Biden for being unable to be president, and now he's trying to say that he's such a great debater. Donald Trump lowered the expectations for Joe Biden so low that if he completes a sentence, if he has a complete thought, the public's going to say, wow, he's perfectly fine. The race is tied. It really is. If you look at the national polling numbers, which you shouldn't, they're dead even. If you look at the key swing states, Donald Trump has a slight advantage. But in the end, I believe the public is going to tune in not to see whether Trump has his act together, but whether Biden does. And that is explicitly because of the campaign that Donald Trump has run. His trying to win the election in April and may cost him the debate here in June.
It's been told to me, Frank, and I wonder if you agree with this, that candidates who believe that debate preparation is designed so they can win policy points or win points of argumentation lose the thread. And the idea is not to do that, but to make yourself as likable and approachable and emotionally available as possible. Where do you come down?
I love that. And I'm going to add the phrase as credible as possible, because in the end, debates aren't about the last 4 years. They're about the next 4. And already Donald Trump has won the debate, to a lot of people's surprise. When they're asked whose administration was better for them, Trump has a significant lead. So this is not going to be about what happened between 2016 and 2020 or 2020 and 2024. They have to prove that they're better able. And in fact, this is something that Donald Trump should be considering, if I were advising him, which I do not, is not to talk about 2025 and 2026 and not to go back and rehash the last 4 years. Keep asking people, if this is how he is in 2024, imagine 2028. Now I'm sounding so horrible. The idea of what things are going to be like 4 years from now, whichever candidate paints a better vision of that future and more credible in the ability to actually get there, that's the candidate that gets more votes. Because, Major, it doesn't matter who wins the debate. What matters is that people change their minds and vote for that candidate.
Very quickly, Frank, does it surprise you that in the polling data, memories of the Trump administration really exist in a 2017, 2018, 2019 context, not a pandemic-ravaged 2020 context?
So you don't know what I'm going to say to you right now, but yes, it does surprise me. I assumed, and I like being candid, and I wish more pundits were, I assumed that after January 6th, Donald Trump was done. And I assumed that the evaluations of him would be based on his COVID work and what happened in those last 12 months. It's not the case. And in group after group, and you do comparisons, Trump, it performs better than Biden in terms of presidential ability, in terms of inflation, in terms of immigration. On the issues that matter most, the public has forgotten that last year and has not forgotten the last 4 years.
Always a pleasure. Frank Luntz, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Federal agents arrested 8 men from Tajikistan over concerns those men could have been plotting a terrorist attack on U.S. soil. That's according to multiple sources familiar with the investigation. The men were arrested earlier this month in Los Angeles, New York, and Philadelphia for suspected ties to ISIS. U.S. Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas shared details about their status earlier today.
The 8 individuals whom you reference are, in fact, in custody. We did not have derogatory information when they were first encountered. Concerns were raised subsequently. We used our law enforcement authorities to apprehend and detain them, and they are in removal proceedings as we speak.
You know Jamaal Bowman ain't going nowhere, right?
Congressman Jamaal Bowman was unable to prevail in his high-profile primary. Next, we will take a look at his race and others last night across the country. You are streaming America Decides.
And if you hold a strong belief, you still must work with other people who don't share that belief, because America hangs in the balance.
CBS News projects that Westchester County, New York Executive George Latimer has defeated incumbent Jamaal Bowman in last night's Democratic primary. The race for New York's 16th district was the most expensive House primary in U.S. history. A focus of Latimer's campaign was condemning Congressman Bowman's criticism of Israel's war with Hamas. For more on last night's primary results, New York and elsewhere, I want to bring in Hunter Woodall. Hunter, why was this race so expensive? I know New York is an expensive media market, but give the viewers a sense of how much money was spent, how much by the campaigns and how much by outside forces.
Well, Major, this primary was obviously very contentious amongst Democrats, and it's always hard to beat an incumbent, but you saw millions and millions and millions in outside spending. You talked about, obviously, the factor that, Israel as an international affairs issue was in this race. The United Democracy Project, a super PAC affiliated with the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, spent over $14 million trying to oust Bowman, according to Ad Impact. That's a lot of money. That was obviously, the majority of the, more than the majority of the spending in this race. But it shouldn't be lost. Bowman had also taken some contentious votes that went against other Democrats at times. I mean, it can't be forgotten. He voted against the bipartisan infrastructure law that was a major part of, obviously, President Biden's early time in office. So he'd taken those stands against Democrats that sort of, laid the groundwork for what we saw last night.
The shorthand for this race was a moderate against a progressive, but Latimer says, hey, wait a minute. I'm a progressive. I'm just not where Bowman is.
Well, that's what you see in Congress. Bowman is a member of the group that, refers to themselves as the squad.
As the squad, yes.
And obviously, the squad can take very lonely stands in Democratic politics sometimes. And it shouldn't be forgotten, too. There are other members of the squad who have primaries later this year, including Cori Bush in Missouri and Ilhan Omar in Minnesota. So we might yet see, this testing of progressives continue out throughout the summer.
Something happened in Colorado with Lauren Boebert. What was that?
So Representative Boebert is one of the more odd primaries that played out this cycle. She was
high visibility, pro-Trump Republican, but who's had some, let us say, moments of public visibility that did not land well, as the kids might say.
And she struggled in the 2022 midterms in her district.
Barely won.
She barely won. 546 votes over the Democratic challenger. That was surprising. So she then moved to she then shifted to running in a different congressional district, more reliably Republican,
vacated by Ken Buck.
Exactly, and that was a more favorable environment for her.
And there were many anti-Boebert candidates who split the anti-Boebert vote, and she prevailed quite easily. Very quickly, what happened in Utah that we should pay attention to?
Donald Trump made a pick in the Senate race, local mayor. That mayor did not do well. It was GOP Congressman John Curtis that actually came out with the win last night. It's projected to be. And obviously, that's a bit of a setback for Trump in a state that is not overwhelmingly Trumpy, but is red.
Hunter Woodall, as always, thanks so very much. As we do from time to time in this program, we want to end by looking at a moment in political history that stands out. On this day, 9 years ago, the Supreme Court ruled the fundamental right to marry is guaranteed to same-sex couples nationwide. The case was brought by a couple who were married in Maryland because Ohio at the time prohibited same-sex marriage. What you're looking at is the scene outside the High Court after the decision was announced. Then President Obama called it a, quote, victory for America.
When all Americans are treated as equal, we are all more free. Today, we can say, in no uncertain terms, that we've made our union a little more perfect.
You might remember this site. Here was the White House that very night, lit in rainbow colors in celebration of that Supreme Court decision. That does it for today. We will be back with another edition of America Decides tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report with John Dickerson, well, that starts right now.